All right. Henry Theriault, one of the folks that's involved with GAW. It's great pleasure to be here again and have a little reunion with many of you. So wonderful to be here. And I'm especially excited about this panel and seeing the Viktor Orban picture that you were going through. It's very, very exciting to hear what we have to say about that. And maybe Vance will make a guest appearance. So our first speaker is Lenka Bustikova. She teaches political science at the University of Florida. She's also taught at the University of Oxford and at Arizona State University. Some of you have heard of that place, I guess. Her research focuses on polarization, party politics, and democratic erosion. Her book, Extreme Reactions, Radical Right Mobilization in Eastern Europe, received the Davis Center Book Prize in Political and Social Studies. So I'm really excited to have her present. And many of you are very familiar with Professor Donald Fixico, who is Muscogee, Seminole, Shawnee, and Sac and Fox. He is a Regents and Distinguished Foundation Professor of History at ASU. He is author and editor of 20 books on American Indian history. And I will add, just my previous experience at JW is always a great speaker, and we'll have some insights that we will all benefit from tremendously. So with that, we'll have welcome.
Great pleasure to be here. It's a tough act to follow, so I just want to preface, I am actually very happy to be back in Phoenix and at ASU. I want to thank Hava for extending the invitation on behalf of the program committee, and I'm excited to share some of my thoughts on the topic. It's a great honor to contribute to the programming on Genocide Awareness Week. And in my sort of 15 to 20 minute remarks, I would like to speculate about the relationship between democracy and not really genocide, but more conditions under which group hostilities or group animosities can be amplified in political competition. So I'm going to draw mostly on a recent article published with Lothar Halavi on confessional illiberalism in Europe, Eastern Europe. It's a little conceptual piece, and then maybe 25% of the presentation is going to sort of highlight politicization of attitudes and how they're molded by party competition in the Czech Republic, which is based on a data that was shared with me very recently by Dr. Irena Kalhousová from the Herzl Institute from Prague. So one of the case studies that, the confessional illiberalism, and I'm going to unpack it soon, is based on the current Hungarian case, and, the deep sorrow, the case has died. But, I would sort of say to Viktor, don't worry, politics is cyclical, and I'm sure we will go through some good cycles and bad cycles again. And I think some of the foundational elements of confessional illiberalism will stay and linger in Hungary and probably will be replicated elsewhere. As I will sort of talk a little bit later, we think sort of in the piece with Lothar, we distinguish three types of illiberalism, and we think that especially the confessional type is particular if it gets entrenched, and it's actually not that easy to do. It sort of has the highest potential of sort of undermining ethnic, racial, and other forms of sort of group harmony between groups, and it's sort of the most dangerous type of illiberalism that we can think of. So this is a picture from St. Stephen. If you are in Budapest, this very close to the buildings, actually still owned by the Central University, which is, one of my degrees is from CU. So I'm sort of a Soros agent forever. And so this sort of motivation for the piece was the politicization of Christian nationalism or Christianity being construed as a civilizational cultural identity by Viktor Orban when he sort of advocated, when he sort of put forward his very harsh immigration policies. Viktor Orban is not a religious man, doesn't go to church, and actually Hungary is quite secular, and the degree of religiosity is quite low. Also, it's a country with one of the highest abortion rates in Europe. And abortion, actually, even Orban is still was legal. So that's sort of one motivation for the talk. And the second motivation is country where I'm from. Is it sort of a unicorn in Europe? Czech Republic has consistently one of the most pro-Israeli foreign policies. There has always been, since '89, there has been very strong consensus on that. But very recently, we see some emerging polarization. And this consensus has been held by both liberal, illiberal politicians. So, for example, this is a picture of former President Miloš Zeman, who is a famous alcoholic, misogynist, racist. However, his pro-Israeli policy has always been very consistent, was very, very supportive, and not just because of his, Islamophobic views. So I will get back to this a little bit later. So this is the article that we wrote with Lotem. She's a postdoc at the University of Constance, and let me speak briefly about what it is. And I'm going to do this very, very quickly. And then see sort of if it stimulates debate or not. So the way we think about illiberalism, we take the concept from Marlene Laruelle, and the illiberalism, it's a very thin concept, and it is a backlash against living liberalism. So the way we follow her thinking about this is that you have to live through the goddamn thing to hate it. So you can hate economic illiberalism, be more think about sort of the implications of expansion of minority rights and accommodation that ensued after 1989. So that's illiberalism. And what's the confessional part? So we think of it as a model of governance that merges state with illiberal, socially conservative parties, religiously infused advocacy networks, churches, sort of, and affiliated organizations. In its contemporary version, we think it's not a fusion of state and church, even though there is a historical precedent of it, but it's a fusion of state and lawyers. And more specifically, something that's known as amicus brief or amicus curiae. These are advocacy groups, if you're familiar with Ordo Juris in Poland. These are basically advocacy networks that at their pinnacle of power, they write proposals for constitutional amendments, proposals and talking points for changes in regulatory frameworks, and sort of influence policy and politics behind the scenes. I study confessional illiberalism. I'm not the first one to point out that Christianity has been kidnapped by far-right parties and illiberal parties and politicians as a civilizational struggle. So it's a cultural divide, not a religious divide. Anya D. Brubaker, Mike Minkenberg wrote about this. It is an emerging, or it has emerged already, as a secular political divide that positions, and I'm speaking mostly of European experience, Islam against the so-called Judeo-Christian civilization. And Phil Gorski wrote about rise of religious nationalism in the United States, which has a slightly different path. Christianity or white Christianity is not a religious identity in this sort of civilizational struggle. Is actually a political identity, and that's where the expertise of political scientists comes in, because the religion is used instrumentally as sort of molding divisions, horizontal divisions between groups. So if you think about the instrumentalization of religion as a political identity and not anything that taps into compassion, religiosity, sort of, moral foundations of communal behavior, then it is also obvious that it, as a thin concept, it sort of reaches to authoritarianism. So a lot of the illiberal policies in Europe and in the United States are linked to heteronormativity, traditional families, authorities. I have written with Petra Guasti. And because it is fundamentally a very secular divide, it also strips away the moral code and compassion from political leaders. Leaders do claim moral authority, but it's a very low bar. And that also explains sort of the proliferation and this marriage of violence and almost paganism with using sort of instrumental religious symbols. So in a way, you have a marriage of trade wives and MMA fighters. Sort of to go back to sort of a more sort of deeper thinking, it's a governance that merges states with advocacy groups that are sometimes affiliated with churches, but very often these are really legal machines and advocacy machines of intermediary organizations that do a lot of advocacy work. And it is an epistemic revolt against modernity, Popperian rationality, Weberian bureaucracy. It is strategic, it's not theocratic. And, sort of if you study its implications, very often it follows the sort of advocates for pronatalist policies, children actually are very important to confessional liberalism, which, doesn't sort of surprise me after hearing the previous talk. State endorsement of traditional family values, heteronormativity geared towards protecting of the in-group Christian nation. And so because it's a horizontal divide, that explains why some of the, ethnically or nation groups that should belong by ethnicity in nation are excluded. So this would be, LGBT groups, anyone who is accused of cosmopolitanism or sort of diverse, non-traditional lifestyles. And, I'm not going to torture you with the three types that we described in the paper. Again, I want to focus on the confessional type, but we think this is a very, very concurrent and potentially a dangerous type. We differentiate it from prejudicial and reactionary liberalism. The prejudicial one would be, your usual suspect, sort of a individual level-based emotion, and the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, as a political party, is sort of the carrier of this type of liberalism. The reactionary liberalism is actually a model that is described in my book that sort of operates at the meso level, and it's a revolt against policies. So it's a reaction against the policy balance. But the confessional type is really deep and sort of seeks to instill macro level changes, merge, it tries to undermine secular state and merge it with socially conservative groups, and build explicit and strategic and very smart and savvy ties to intermediary organizations. And so the examples of this, we draw a little bit, or Lotham wrote most of this, we draw on some historical cases just to illustrate the foundations of it, even though we sort of think of it more along the Fidesz type of policies that were implemented in Hungary under Orban. But Unity Party, National Fascist Party, and the Brothers of Italy would be sort of political parties that would carry this. So just to give you an example, so you have, as what are these crazy, what is she talking about, these crazy intermediate organizations? So let me give you an example how it looks like in practice from the Czech Republic. There is a group that was formed in 2017. It was a parental advocacy group. A bunch of conservative parents got together, a non-profit, poor, formed in 2017. By 2021, and so you see sort of now they are much better funded and much more well-known and much stronger. So this is from their poster that says mother and father, or parent one, parent two. So it's a poster that advocates for traditional families, and above that is a picture of one of the leaders of Christian Democratic Party in the Czech Republic, form an alliance. So this group of parents that nobody ever heard about, by 2021 drafted legal briefs for the Constitutional Court deciding on the legality of foreign adoptions of same-sex couples, and has sort of had been working in the background in fighting the ratification of the Istanbul Convention and other issues. So this is not a church group, it's a socially conservative group. It's an advocacy group that is trying to, mimicking the Ordo Juris strategy, or sort of legal advocacy strategy. Confessional liberalism shares a lot of features with populism, fascism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. But there are some differences. So with populism, they're both thin, both thin ideologies and majoritarian. The difference between confessional and liberalism and populism is that in populism you need a direct linkage between the leader and the voters. The confessional liberalism works more through intermediary sort of linkages, and leaders claim more authority, meaning they're more moral. With fascism, we have sort of discussed this quite a bit in the paper. There is a lot of emphasis on communitarianism and in-group motherhood. That's very important, but the motherhood has to be confined to the boundaries. But there are some differences. So we think one of the major differences is that the confessional liberalism, at least initially, is not violent. It's not revolutionary, but it tries to rewrite a new social contract, and again uses the specific linkages to shape public opinion and support for policy. With nationalism, again, we sort of make a big, they are both exclusionary, But, when you invoke a religion, as a part of party competition, it has, in its pure form, confessional liberalism doesn't have ethnic foundation, but it uses religious symbols to delineate boundaries between the state, and the religious symbols are used as political strategy to subdue political opposition. And, confessional liberalism can, but does not have to be authoritarian. It's certainly, all modern soft autocracies derive legitimacy from elections. So what you see in Hungary, the elections were free and fair, but they were tilted. And the result is quite stunning. And so the elections are important. So that is maybe the major difference. Of course, it gets more complicated as leaders want to keep power. And sort of another big difference is that the leaders really try to derive legitimacy from religious symbols. So what's sort of having studied these, this animal, I sort of one of the implications is that the national and religious identity becomes political identity, and what you very often see is that partisan sorting or sort of party queuing, they really play a role in forming, shaping public opinion, and really, contributing to polarization. So I want to sort of very briefly, I have two graphs to show you as a case of molding views on Israel, which has always been, again, very homogeneous, I would say uncritically supportive of the state of Israel. And so, but you do see these cracks and slow-paced polarization. So again, Czech Republic is a unicorn and exceptionally pro-Israeli, both for illiberal and liberal parties were supportive, but we sort of see from the survey that Irena just gave me, we do see indication of polarization. So this is a survey done by Herzl Institute. They did it in 23, 24, 25. I'll just show you mostly data from 25, very recent, December 25 and January 2024. So in one of the questions that they asked in the survey was whether the Czech public agrees with demands of Israelis versus Palestinians. So you can see that in 2024, almost 50% of the respondents basically agreed equally with the demands of Israelis and Palestinians. You see sort of the red part is the agreement with the Israelis. So, predominantly there is more agreement with the Israelis and a tiny bit agreement with the Palestinians. And then within less than 10 or 11 months, you see this huge shift when the sort of equal agreement with the demands shrinks to about 20-22%. The support for Israelis grows quite a bit, but so does the support for the demands of Palestinians. And why? And again, I sort of followed the coverage in the Czech Republic. It is, there have been no major changes in sort of the mainstream coverage of the conflict. So what explains this sort of fast sort of polarization when the middle ground has been polarized, and it can be, it's messy, but let me just simplify. It can be sort of understood if we understand the dynamics of party competition in Czech Republic and in a way westernizing the conflict or sort of taking some cues from Western Europe. So this is a survey that doesn't ask about supporting demands. It's a question about sympathy. So it taps into emotion. They couldn't ask sort of a different question. So they asked about sympathy with Israel. So on the top, you see that the most sympathetic voters are voters of the far-right party, Stachilo, that actually didn't make it closer to the parliament. And then a very, again, on general, a lot of sympathy for Israelis by liberal, pro-democratic, pro-European parties. The far-right is a mess. I can go into it in the Q&A. But the main driver of polarization is sort of a new, very aggressive far left that has been formed in the Czech Republic quite recently that, again, has a lot of features of extremist far left in Eastern Europe. So to summarize and sort of going back to the beginning, we live in an era of backlash, but maybe now there's a backlash against illiberalism, instrumentalized by political leadership. Religion and sort of civilizational divides are weaponized as political identities. We think that I sort of think that the confessional type is the most dangerous to democracy and ethnic and religious harmony, because it's a comprehensive plan to rewrite all agreements. And it's a merger of a liberal society and conservative, extremist conservative parties and advocacy groups. And in our view, the solution is actually what we have seen just in Hungary, is to the only way to get out of this is a presence of moderate, compassionate, conservative parties that can diffuse extremism and address sort of demands and desires of socially conservative voters in a compassionate and moderate way. Thank you for your attention.
I want to thank him for the invitation to speak on the panel today. It was like 2 or 3 months ago that we ran into each other at the bottom of the elevator outside of Core Hall. He says, "Hey, Don, can you speak on a panel coming up at Genocide Awareness Week?" I said, "Sure, glad to help you out." And then he told me it was on democracy and genocide. And so I caught the elevator, came up to my stairs. I thought, what did I agree to do? To talk about a topic that I don't really know much about. So I have been learning. And as scholars, what we do is we ask questions, and it's our imagination, and more than that, it's our curiosity that drives questions that we need to ask to learn. So as late as 11:30 this morning, I've been going down rabbit holes and learning this and learning that and thinking, oh, gee, I didn't know that. And so rabbit holes are like black holes. Sometimes as scholars, we go down rabbit holes and it just leads to another rabbit hole and reaches to another rabbit hole. And then by the end of the day, what have we accomplished? Not a whole lot, just going down rabbit holes. Now, I'm American Indian. On my father's side, I am Muscogee and Seminole. And so we believe in a trickster called Chofin. And Chofin means rabbit. And rabbit is a trickster. And so a lot of the tribes, there's like 36 tribes, 36 tribes have a trickster called Coyote. Well, our coyote, the trickster, is Chofin, the rabbit. And why a rabbit? Well, actually, the rabbit is also a hare. And so my people believe, and I was brought up believing too, that when you look at a bunny, a small rabbit, or a rabbit just in general, then, you appreciate it and you stare at it and you begin to like it. But don't stare at the eye, because the eye will get larger and larger and almost pull you into its reality. And then you'll become so fixed on the rabbit, you'll be so fixed on Chofin that you'll kind of experience different things and maybe even kind of lose your mind for 2 minutes, 2 hours, or something like that. So going down these rabbit holes, I've been talking to Chofin. And so we do that when you're raised close to your traditions. So my conversation with Chofin this morning, Chofin, is this just another rabbit hole you're leading me down, or are you going to help me out? I need some help, Show me something interesting. So I'm Googling things and looking things up on genocide and democracy. And so Chofin, I think, was really kind of kind to me this morning and helping me out and leading me along the way. In genocide and democracy, I wonder, do animals commit genocide? Well, actually they do, kind of. So they will actually destroy their own species or empowerment or a food source or something like that. In particular, ants are really tough, wolves and chimpanzees. And so these 3 species of animals will actually commit something like almost genocide in hunting down their own kind. So the next question was, well, if animals commit something like genocide like people do all throughout human history, why not plants? The answer is yes, almost. Not a purposeful kind of design genocide to go out and for a plant to extinguish another plant species. But in particular, sage and also the walnut tree will then kind of put toxins or chemicals into the ground around it so that no other plants can come and invade its space. And so it's kind of a protective measure, kind of a defensive measure. So that's what Chopin has talked to me today about, and led me to, because I'd never thought about plants and animals and genocide in the same conversation. So what I have here today is genocide and democracy, and why does it happen? And so on the left are expressions, words that mean genocide in different ways. And on the right, I looked up like 5 acts of genocide according to the United Nations. And so mass killings, imposed psychological fear, bad living conditions so that a group of people can hardly sustain themselves anymore. And the prevention of the birth rate is also another kind of practice or form of genocide, as well as the displacement or the removal of children, meaning residential schools or boarding schools. So when you look at democracies, and throughout the entire world, at least according to this map in 2017, there's like 96 democracies in about 167 countries, depending on which source, because some sources say there's 193 countries, some sources say there's 195. But I've chosen about 8 of these, including the United States. And if you look at the map, and so the countries that are in blue are the ones that kind of note that those are democratic countries, just to give us an idea for this conversation. So when we look at the indigenous populations within these democracies, within these 8, then Norway has something like 40,000 Sami people, and the number of Vin is about 70,000 today. These are today's population. The Sami, about 10,000 in Finland, 40,000 in Sweden, 50,000 Inuit in Greenland. Now, why Greenland? So even though that I'm talking about Denmark on the left side, that it controls Greenland. And so by controlling Greenland, then Denmark actually controls the 50,000 Inuit who live in Greenland. And 8 million Irish, I'm going to have to go back to 1840, so next slide or two and kind of straighten that up for you. In Australia, about 984,000 Aborigines, and First Nations people about 1.8 million, and in the United States, about 5.4 American Indians. So let's talk a little bit more about specifics. So if you look at Finland, Sweden, and Norway all together, then it's been an effort by these 3 countries, in particular Norway, to kind of, and I'm going to use the word Americanized, but to Norwegianized, and to make them like us. So the Sami people being the original indigenous people, being converted into kind of being recreated, remolded by the Norwegian government. And so this is a continual practice. Now, the interesting aspect here is that this is a continual practice around the world, all throughout time, to make the others like us. There's a kind of a phenomenon of us versus them, but to make them like us. And so that's a practice throughout the history of humankind. The Norwegian government has tried to outlaw the Sami and the Bend languages. They've not been able to do that. So these languages are still spoken, but what they have done is to contain the population of these 2 groups to the extreme polar parts of the country of Norway and in the polar kind of community around. Then they live in very harsh conditions, living conditions there. Interestingly, that Sweden actually controlled Finland at one time. In as early as the 17th century, they imposed a kind of a Sami tax on the land. That meant that the Sami lived on the land, but they had to pay a tax to the Swedish government. And by doing that, that's literally taken away the land rights of the Sami people. So this is kind of a form of genocide, of controlling people and not allowing them to have the freedom, the autonomy, the sovereignty, etc. And from about 1944 to 1945, the end of World War II, then there's something called the Lapland War. And in the war, then fought obviously by Germany, but the Sami people, remember that they are the top picture, the top right up there, are Sami people. And so they're really kind of a reindeer culture. And so very interesting that their whole livelihood depended on the reindeer, and of course the Ven a little bit below in that picture. But in the Lapland War, in World War II, the Sami people were kind of caught in between the 2 sides. In fact, Sami people had to fight other Sami people in World War II. So they were put in that kind of pressurized situation. And so in that way, that was a form of genocide as well. Something very unusual going down that rabbit hole that I found. So when we look at Denmark and Canada, then Denmark, and remember controlling Greenland, then in 1966 through the 1970s, sterilized 4,500 Inuit women. Now, the idea of sterilization is not new. It's not just an American thing, but I have in parentheses that in the 1960s through the 1970s, about 3,400 American Indian women were sterilized against their own consent in this country. And maybe started as early as the 1930s, and maybe I've looked at other sources, and maybe 3,400 is a lower number. So I went with a lower number here. Now, the same situation happened in Canada, and it's still kind of going on. So from 1975 to 2024, then about 15,000 First Nations women have been sterilized without their consent. Now, that's one part. Remember the 5 acts of genocide that I described to you. So that's one way of doing that, of slowing down the birth rate, because us versus them, we don't want them to outnumber us. And so that's the logic behind that. Displacement of children. So this is really kind of interesting that in Canada, there were at least 139 residential schools. Interesting that in Canada, they're referred to as residential schools. In the U.S., they're just called boarding schools or Indian boarding schools. So I find that kind of interesting. But in the United States, there are at least 357 and maybe as many as 400 Indian boarding schools. And so again, displacement of the children, converting them, assimilating them, Americanizing them, or Canadianizing them, and so forth. And so this happens. But also in Canada, then you can see kind of the history of Denmark on the left and of Canada on the right, but in parentheses, it's American stats. So in the 1850s and 1860s, then colonial wars. So military attacks by the Canadians against First Nations, Inuit, and another group of people who are indigenous called Métis. And so that happens in the 1850s, the 60s, and also the 1873 in the Cypress Hills Massacre and the Northwest Rebellion in 1885. I don't have numbers for them, but it shows that mass killings, massacres are part of the extermination process or the so-called genocide that happened in Canada and also elsewhere. So let's look at Australia on the left and then Ireland. And some of it kind of gets mixed up. I'll try to straighten it out. So a very popular term in Australia is called the stolen generations. The stolen generations are the displaced children that were taken to boarding school and all of that. And so that happens between about 1910 through the 1970s. About 100,000 children, and 5 or 6 years old, 7 or 8, 9 or 10. And so they're off to residential boarding schools. And so as this happens, then I have over here that the boarding schools happened within the United States. And I thought, if you might want to read about this, a little bit about residential schools, the lower right-hand corner, Too Afraid to Cry by Ali Colby Eckerman, which was published in 2012. And it won the, what I found out this morning, was it won the Wyndham Campbell Prize in Literature. And that's the prize you want to win, because the prize is $175,000. So go figure. Yeah, you can take the year off, write another book, but that's one of the prizes, one of the world-leading prizes. Another book that I have up here, if those of you who are curious, this book is called White Mother to a Dark Race by Margaret Jacobs, a professor at Nebraska, and she won the Bancroft Prize for this in 2009. And so when you look at the literature, there's more literature and other literature, but throughout the entire world, over a dozen countries had boarding school. That's what I find remarkable. It's not just an American thing. It's not just a Canadian thing. It's not just an Australian thing, but over 12 countries. And when you look at the 12 countries, I don't have them listed for you, but it's interesting. If you look that up, then they're almost on all the different continents around the world. Much of it is due to religion, Catholic residential schools, etc. So you have the church and that kind of belief system. Again, it's not just teaching indigenous students to read and write, but to also to change their way of thinking in terms of religion and to change them that way. So there we go. So I have that in the United States. We're talking about frontier wars in Australia from the 1780s to the 1930s, over 400 massacres, over 400 massacres. But in the United States, there's easily over 100,000 campaigns, skirmishes, battles, attacks authorized by the United States government against Native people. Now, there are 578 federally recognized tribes, but there have been over 120 tribes that no longer exist. Total extinction. And you would think, well, Native people are still here today. At one time in the late 1800s, American Indians were popularized as the vanishing race. In the 48 states, the population of Native people dropped below 238,000. Dropped below 238,000. Now you take 238,000 and you think, well, what was the population when Columbus arrived? Lowest estimates about 5 million on up to 50 or 60 million. So let's take the high one. From 50 million down to 238,000 by 1900, the end of the Indian Wars in the United States. Why not the vanishing race? Yeah, it was happening. So why did anthropologists, ethnologists rush out to the West? To preserve Native culture before it was gone, before it would be extinct. That's the reason. So why does all of this happen? So these are just suggestions, but prejudice and racism at very deep levels, psychological hatred for another group, dislike for sharing the same space, fear of intermarriage, the disdain for being ruled by an indigenous person, perhaps extreme nationalism. And I think this is my last slide right here. How can genocide end? These are idealistic, but these are suggestions. Maybe Chofin suggested them to me. Rabbit is a trickster. See, in the Indian world, we talk to our tricksters, you know, Chofin, are you just messing with me or what? You know, Chofin, why not help me out this time in this rabbit hole that I'm going down? Let it be helpful. I need a little help here, so give me a break. So we talk to our tricksters. And so the indigenous population throughout the entire world is like 476 million in 90 countries. But when you look at the population, it's like 6% of the global population, like 8.3 billion people on this planet. And when you look at the indigenous population, it's like 15% of the poorest people on Earth. So maybe we can rethink our views about other people to begin with. I know it's idealistic, but that's my suggestion today. Positive communication between sides. Try to get to learn the other people, what they're about, their values, etc. And maybe even projects, working on projects together, a shared experience. I think that's a cooperation and finding some way to work with other people. But I find it, and I'll end with this very short story, that it's in World War II that the veterans, American veterans from World War II, when they see each other and they're dying, a lot of every day, that a veteran from World War II finding another veteran of World War II, they hug and embrace. Because of that brotherhood, they fought together against the enemy. But what I find more miraculous is that a Japanese veteran, and there's about 1,000 left in the world, a Japanese veteran will meet an American veteran of World War II, and they will embrace. They went through something together, that shared experience. Thank you.
So thank you. It's very interesting to think about those two dimensions together. So what I'm trying to figure out, I guess I'll start with Lenka. What causes what? Is liberalism used in order to undermine democracy? Or what's the driving force, let's say, in Hungary? If I understand correctly, what he created there is an alternative system to the normal government. So all the things that you call confucianism, it's kind of something else is happening there that is not happening within the government system. So you can elaborate on that. And for Don, my question is, are we really right to use the word democracy? If I'm listening to the newspaper, there is no such thing as democracy anymore in the world. And maybe there never was. So where is the liberal justification for what's going on in those wonderful places called nowhere, Denmark and so forth? What is democratic here?
Since that's a tough question, I'm going to let Lenka go first.
Is this the microphone?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Hava, thank you for your question. So, what is driving? Well, there is the best article there is to understand Orban's rise to power is an article by Bela Grešković that talks about civic circles that were mobilized in 2010 and helped Orban to catapult to power. So yes, there are a lot of narratives about economic hardship and corruption and the socialists being corrupt and leaking tapes. But his sort of brilliant analysis of Orban being able to win speaks about weaponization of church-going groups, especially in middle and upper middle class in Hungary. I mean, the story changes a little bit later, but he basically said he was able to tap into groups of people who were gathering together, and sort of he created this huge network of what he called civic circles that have been activated for elections. So in a way, it is a variation of bad civil society, or civil society or civic groups, church groups, that were politicized. And I think that's the most convincing and sort of profound argument that I have read about Orban rising to power. If you think about what Magyar did, Magyar didn't go after churches, but the whole campaign of Magyar was based on two issues, absolutely horrendous Hungarian economy. And the second sort of leg of the campaign was call for a humane society. So, really toning down all these social struggles. But he campaigned in middle-sized cities. And really, this is a conservative politician that used to be in Fidesz. This is going to be a conservative government, hopefully less corrupt, more humane, and better than the previous one. But he sort of understands the power of socially conservative electorate. This is not a vein of liberal Budapest. This is a vein of middle cities that are just sick and tired of absolutely dysfunctioning healthcare system and just this permanent fear-mongering. So I think using sort of Orban's example, I think that it is something that's extremely I'm a trained sociologist, I'm sure it's underappreciated, sort of intermediary groups of civic and socially conservative associations coming together, and then, sort of the energy being mobilized for elections. You can see it from civil society, or you can see it in fight against illiberalism. A lot of that goes through civil society mobilization, actual redemocratization. And just, it's a chicken egg problem that I don't think I can solve now, but I am really convinced that a lot of the illiberal wave is manufactured from the top. And I'm happy to unpack it.
What's the goal?
The goal is, of course, absolute personal enrichment of politicians, their families, their friends, their high school buddies, their soccer buddies. So enrichment, enrichment and power. But I wouldn't underestimate sort of, when I talk politician, there are some ideologically driven politicians, but a lot of the politicians are really amass enormous wealth through a true liberalism. There's very little, ideological commitment. If you think about Fixico, Babiš, and the largest part is different. A lot of this is just instrumentalizing cleavages for political gains. It has nothing to really do with some convictions, and that's why it's so dangerous and so healthy.
Yeah, I think my question in a different way was like, do democracies really exist? Is that kind of, well, I'm going to say ideally, yes. Ideally, yes, because we have to have something good to live for and values. So always there's the reality and there's the ideal. And so it's the ideal that this country is really kind of based on. But I'm also going to lean on Ken Duncan a little bit because, you know, he left this room here and gave the presentation, said that he was driving 2.5 hours to talk about being happy. We have to find some kind of optimism every day, and it's a human spirit to surge forward and to find that happiness when it's not a whole lot of great's going on. Resilience, the human spirit, the positive, you have to continue to work in that way rather than the opposite way because too many people are thinking the opposite way. I've had almost the same conversation over the last 2 weeks with about 4 different people. What can we do as individuals to make things better? Because I find these individuals somehow, we just start having, what's going on? And that if the both of us can continue to do better and to think about, you know, what's good about life and being the best person we can, maybe it'll be like smallpox and start spreading around. But we have to do something because, and I think it starts with us being as an example to others.
Can I go? Okay. This person is wondering about the indigenous communities in Central Asia and the Far East and how those communities are doing, or are they doing anything like the indigenous communities that you talked about in terms of preserving identity and
I think that they're trying to do that, but it's in a more difficult way because they have fewer resources. The examples that I showed, you know, in the slides, were democracies, you know, with governments who have more resources to provide, and some of the places in other parts of the world are not democracies, and they're semi-democracies, and so there's more governmental control or autocratic rule that prevents indigenous people, and so they're actually suppressed even more. And so they're in a very dire situation there. And what is the answer to that? You know, if it's hard to say, but I think it kind of starts within each person somehow, because even in the most dire situation, somehow the human spirit is so resilient that it rises, and it has to, until other things kind of, you know, make things happen and for a change. But we've got to be doing a better job all over. I know that's not the best answer, but that's an answer right now. Forgive me also.
Andrew, I know you've got questions. I can, but I don't want to jump down this, but so a question, or well, actually sort of a comment for Don. I have to say, for someone who just sort of studied this and went down some rabbit holes, there are many really interesting insights in your presentation. For me, even though this wasn't a focus of what you were saying, it's the idea of botanical colonialism and genocide. And I started also to think about the way in which, if you look at Hawaii, for instance, the way in which invasive species have completely changed the botanical makeup of Hawaii, Big Island especially, and that has directly impacted the people and their relationship with the land and so forth. So I just want to say, I don't know if I have a question. It's just, I think that's a brilliant thought that you have, brilliant idea, and something that I have not heard people write on very much or at all. So I really appreciate that.
It's not my idea.
Okay.
I'll bring it. I'll blame it on Chopin. Chopin.
Okay.
The rabbit. But
that's good.
It seems to me that we may not realize it, but we're in a transition of tremendous change. Just look at the field of technology, how fast it's changing. Can the human spirit, in terms of maturity and wisdom, keep up with that? And it's not just a steady change, but it's an accelerating change in my mind, and it's happening faster and faster and faster. We also look at globalization. So, I mean, NPR, you just type in, you know, what's going on in another country, and you get instant information. Now, whether it's correct or not, that's the next question. So it's so interesting that the human species, we believe what we want to believe. And that's part of our own downfall. We believe what we want to believe. But if we teach in colleges and universities to think critically, we teach people to really to make up their own mind, but to look at the evidence. There's a huge difference between opinion and point of view, but to come away with a point of view based on knowledge that you've actually have looked up and compared to the sources, and that's what we do at the university.
That's great. Thank you. And for Lenka, I was going to ask, I found it very interesting where you talked about this sort of religious surface, but the mechanism is legal. And what that makes me think is, okay, when people are doing this, I have my own sort of thoughts on this that I'll present on Thursday, but I think you're taking this in all sorts of interesting directions. I guess the question is, if people are using legal means, the structural legal methods of a country, I would say Donald Trump is an expert at doing that. He uses lawsuits and so forth in just the way he used to in his business, and he's incredibly effective at doing that. Part of it is he put the judges in positions of power that are judging his cases, but would you say in that case that the people who are pushing against what we'd see as positive outcomes of a legal system that works in what we consider a democratic way are actually still staying within that legal structure, but are manipulating it effectively? Or are they undermining the structure? That is, have they fundamentally changed what the sort of legal framework is we're dealing with? And does that mean that it can't function, with different input, it can't function appropriately? Not that it ever did, don't get me wrong, but it's certainly better than it has, certainly in the United States in recent years.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As you probably know, Orban is a lawyer by training, absolutely brilliant. Everything that he has done in Hungary has always been legal and very smart. And the playbook that he has developed has been copied, I would say across the world. So, if you can access sort of a situation when you are in the position of drafting constitutional amendments, policy, changing regulatory frameworks, that's sort of the highest point. A lot of these, conservative groups are not at that level of power because they also have to find allies. And there's an enormous amount of transnational advocacy associated with this. So, for example, one of the imports from the United States are prayer breakfasts in parliaments, which has, they never existed before. It's a fantastic, vehicle to get your politicians on your side. So this is, of course, the judges are tilted. So, there is an issue whether the judiciary system is clean or not. But I would like to emphasize that this is brilliant. These people are using democratic tools and the generosity of democratic rules of the game to get at their preferred outcomes. A lot of these outcomes are legal, and they are sort of speaking as a political scientist who deals with sort of how to declassify democracy. So it depends what you think a democracy is. I sort of subscribe to the liberal democratic model, and I think minority protection is a fundamental core of liberal democracy. So but a lot of these changes in legal structures and policy structures undermine minority rights, both of ethnic, religious, sexual groups. So in a way, they're not going to change the democracy, but they're going to change the fundamental nature. It's going to be a majoritarian democracy with much weakened minority protections that will eventually lead to democratic erosion. But in its initial stages, it's legal, it's changing it. If you look at some of the democracy scores for Norway, Sweden, these are countries that always have one of the highest rankings in global rankings of democracy. So it's a long way, but fundamentally it's about a commitment to minority protection, which these countries have all signed in Copenhagen criteria. When they joined the European Union, they said we will protect minority rights. So they're a little bit uncomfortable with it. So I guess that would be my last.
Thank you.
We have a question from Richie. Yeah, thank you both for your talks. I had a question for you, Lenka, about something you had said about how in these movements that you're describing, religion is being used strategically, that these are political projects, not religious ones. Religious symbols are being marshaled or even perhaps manipulated for political purposes. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you take to be at stake in that claim. So you mentioned, for instance, that Greece is secular, Orban is not himself a churchgoer. The people promoting these movements are parents, not priests. So I think I understand at least part of your claim. On the other hand, I sometimes worry that that when we too neatly divide what's political and what's religious, we're sort of operating with a preconceived notion of what religion is, and perhaps that's one political theology amongst others. It's certainly the view of, say, some Vatican officials and so forth, that this is not real religion. But I wonder if we're sort of entitled to assume that elite conception of what religion is the correct one, particularly when there's these sort of populist rejections of elite culture at stake. So it's not that I necessarily want to say this is genuine religion, but I'm curious, kind of in your view, why not, or what makes you want to say it's not religious?
That makes sense.
Yes, thank you for this very well deserved pushback. So it's very messy, and I think the reason why I'm making these strong statements, and it's not a fusion, is that I want to alert people to the fact that a lot of attention has been paid, let's say, to Vatican or evangelical groups, basically advocating for majoritarian democracies and in a way contributing to democratic decay. And I think there is it's very important to mention that. But what I observe are these groups that are religiously infused, not fundamentally. These are not primarily religious projects. So parental advocacy groups, both actually of mothers and fathers or conservative groups, are one of the sort of big emerging players in the field. Or in the Baltics, there are small civic groups that deal with medical issues of conceiving naturally. So a lot of the sort of advocacy goes about, teaching partners how not to use contraceptives and regulate. So in a way, there is a religious element, but it sort of goes beyond that. And another thing I want to point out, and I'm still in the process of thinking this through. This varies country by quite a bit. But one also has to see where the church authorities stand. And so very often when you sort of look at party composition and sort of different parties align differently with churches and or these advocacy groups, is that very often some of these very harsh policies are not in the best long-term interests of the churches. And very often bishops are sometimes instructed to stay away or go in. But sort of strategically speaking, these intermediary socially conservative groups that are not ancillary organizations of the churches have different incentives and different time horizons and different political sort of linkages. Like the Ordo Iuris in Poland, with our study, we are not a church organization. Of course, they work. So just like I'm trying to draw attention to these intermediary groups that have, this is something that has happened, as you know, for 5 or 10 years. It's very new. They are mushrooming, and so you look at some policy outcomes and you think, where did it came from? And then if you don't understand these things bubbling underground, then I really think you cannot understand some of the outcomes. So that's all I'm trying to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you for this excellent panel. One thing, just quickly, I was thinking about when I made opening remarks. And I mentioned the UN resolution, the March 25th on the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement, it passed overwhelmingly. But the countries that did not vote in favor of it are ones we tend to identify as democracies. They voted against it or abstained, which is a polite way of saying no. The Netherlands is the only country that's having any recognition of that. So, it's not only that these things can happen in democracies, but what democracies recognize and don't recognize, right? With, atrocity crimes and against humanity, something about that. We're running a little bit behind. We're going to finish this session off and finish to our next one, which will start on the chunk of it. So 15 minutes. And so please take a break, caffeinate, hydrate, some snacks out there, stretch your legs, do whatever you need to do.